microphone. Yes, it's very crisp, isn't it? Animus ASMR when. Hey everyone, Joey here, aka Animus, and I was not expecting to be doing 2 discography reviews in a row, but I just received a Patreon request on a £25 tier from Polonized, which I was not expecting at all. Many thanks to him or her for supporting the channel. Greatly appreciated. You're amazing. So pack your bags because we're heading east to talk about every album by the Yellow Magic Orchestra. The Yellow Magic Orchestra were formed in Japan in 1978 by Haruomi Hosono, Yukihiro Takahashi, and Ryuichi Sakamoto. All 3 were and still are extremely prolific musicians outside of the band, with extensive solo work and many contributions to various little projects here and there. While I hadn't yet delved into all 8 of their albums prior to this request, I had certainly heard of them for quite a while thanks to my interest in early electronic music. See, while I obviously wasn't around at the time to see it happening, 1978 seems like quite an interesting time for the electronic music scene. While synthpop was just beginning to emerge, the only real popular electronic artists in the mainstream around that time were the likes of Jean-Michel Jarre, Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream, Eno, and Vangelis, making electronic music a distinctly European genre. So after finding out that there was a trio formed in Japan during that era, I was seriously excited to see what kind of flavour of music they'd be putting out. So I went into their discography with eager ears and genuinely not really any idea of what I was going to be treated to. So without further ado, let's talk about some YMO. Sorry, didn't see you there. So as I said, as I entered the world of the Yellow Magic Orchestra, I genuinely had basically no preconceptions. Obviously, I'd previously heard what the general sound of 1970s electronic music was, but I had no idea whether this was going to be in a similar vein to the stuff I'd heard before, or whether I was going to experience a completely new, unique brand. And after listening to their self-titled debut, honestly, forget Jarre, forget Kraftwerk, forget Eno. With this album, YMO show that they're completely in their own lane, and not only that, but they know how to write a bloody tune. This is a relatively brief album at a pretty snappy 37 minutes, but across its runtime you're treated to so many vibrant, colourful, zany delights. That shows that not only do they have the pop sensibilities to write hooks that are unerringly on the money, they're not afraid to experiment and go in whatever direction they want with their music. From the vaguely Das Model-esque vocal synth-pop of La Femme Chinoise, to the jazzy qualities of instrumentals such as Cosmic Surfin' and Tong Poo. Poo. To Simoon, which can only be described as the sound of a Japanese jazz cafe in space. There's even 2 interludes with just the most crazy, obnoxious beeping and blooping sounds, which despite their retro quality could almost fit in on like a Square Pusher album and not sound out of place. Genuinely. And oh my god, do not even get me started on Firecracker. That is a near-perfect track in almost every way, and probably the high-key bop of the millennium. I should probably discuss Takahashi's vocals on this album and their future records. I think some people could get slightly turned off by his voice, as it's not the most perfect-sounding thing in the world, but I actually really enjoy his singing. I think his tone and the kind of energy he brings to their music fits right in with the sounds they use. He certainly has a lot of charisma, and that's the most important thing to me, really, the energy you bring. I've given this album several listens, and I absolutely love it. There's a surprising amount of detail and layers to unpick for an album of its time. It's actually really quite a dense record, but still remains extremely accessible. This thing is just a blast from front to back. We're starting off with a bang, and this had me unbelievably excited for what else I was in for. And so we move on to 1979's Solid State Survivor, which is without a doubt one of their most successful and well-loved albums they ever put out. With this album, they took a far more focused approach than their first album, and instead of spending a lot of time experimenting with wacky ideas, I feel like they really tried to hone in on their hook writing skills and made more or less a straight synth-pop album here. It's actually even shorter than their self-titled album at an extremely tight 32 minutes, with just 8 tracks of pop song kind of length. Well, I can't say I found it as intriguing and fascinating as their first record. I kind of love this one as well. There's really not any fluff on Solid State Survivor. They kind of just go bang, bang, bang with all of their best hooks. Zip in, zip out, and deliver a tight, It's a joyful half hour of fast-paced, light, breezy synth-pop fun, with virtually no fat to trim. And not that it needed it, but there's even a nice bit of variety here, with the more moody atmospheres of Castalia and Insomnia, which I guess you could call the album's little breather moments before further headbanging ensues. There's even a cover of the Beatles track Day Tripper, which, pretty unsurprisingly turns out well. I mean, to someone who's not used to the sounds of electronic music in the 70s and 80s, this album might sound extremely cheesy to you. And given that most of these tracks contain vocals in some form, if you're not a big fan of them, then this album might turn you off. But luckily that happens to not be the case at all with me. Solid State Survivor is not a deep album by any means, but it absolutely slaps like my Good evening, Giuseppe von Oxenberg here, assistant scriptwriter for the AnimusTheNerd YouTube profile, as I'm sure you already know, due to my appearance in last week's programme. Now, I would just like to apologise for a highly insensitive and inappropriate joke that Joseph there had just made, and we unfortunately had to censor. I told him time and time again that it was not suitable for broadcast to the general public, and yet he still does not listen. Sorry. Okay. We at AnimusTheNerd Incorporated would just like you to know that we do not condone the use of fictional accounts of abusive parenting in similes that describe one's personal opinions on a musical composition. We apologise again for the inconvenience caused by this interruption and hope that you enjoy the remainder of the programme. How do I turn this off?
Right now. Japanese gentleman, stand up, please. Right now. Japanese gentleman, stand up, please. Right now. Japanese gentleman, stand up, please. Right now.
Ooh, multiplies is an interesting one. Some will argue that it shouldn't be in this video, given it's a sub-half-hour project released on 10-inch vinyl and billed in most places as a mini-album. But I definitely think it's worth talking about, as it's, quite distinct in the context of their discography. Even more surprising than the fact that this album doesn't even breach the 30-minute mark is that 5 of the 12 tracks on here are comedic sketches performed by the group known as Snakeman Show, titled Snakeman Show 1 to 5. And only 4 of the remaining pieces are even full pieces of music, rather than interludes or reprises. Meaning that rather than a full musical album or EP, Multiplies feels more to me like an episode of a Japanese synth pop Monty Python. Yeah, I guess I'll just discuss the actual full-length pieces of music on here first. It's kind of like the sound of Solid State Survivor, but I guess with a bit more of a rock edge, and even more light-hearted and silly than their previous work, and takes itself even less seriously than their previous work, which in the case of a track like the cover of the Archie Bell and the Drells track, Tighten Up, subtitled Japanese Gentlemen Stand Up Please, borders on, let's say, annoyingness? Japanese Gentlemen Stand Up Please! I mean, it's a kind of annoyingness that I personally found quite entertaining and fun, I guess. Particularly when the track suddenly gets a surprise reprise after the next interlude, with the announcement of "Here we go again." Probably the only track on here I enjoy to the same extent and in the same way as that most of their previous work is Citizens of Science, which is not a particularly serious track in any way, but it feels like it has the most effort put into it, the most detail, and probably the best hook on the album. The title track, which is basically a ska track, was pretty fun as well. All the other musical pieces I didn't mention are just kind of okay. But yes, don't worry, I will talk about the interludes themselves. 2 are in English and 3 are in Japanese. The Japanese ones unfortunately have no translations anywhere on the internet as far as I can see. If I just so happen to have any bilingual viewers, then any insight would be greatly appreciated into what's actually going on in these pieces, other than just a lot of men shouting at each other. They could be really funny, but most likely I'll never know, seeing as it's pretty much a 1 in a million chance that any of my 400 subscribers just so happen to speak English and Japanese. But the English ones that I can understand, Snake Man Show 1 is a conversation between 2 guys about a business contract of some sort, where one guy is just randomly stuttering for no reason whatsoever. Okay. And Snake Man Show 2 is basically the same 2 guys talking about Japan and the people in Japan, and basically pretty unsubtly satirizing the stereotypes of the country as viewed by Westerners such as myself, which is actually apparently what they were doing on some of their previous music, where they were basically hamming up the Japaneseness to a point where it was kind of tongue-in-cheek. But, yeah, the sketches themselves. Should I just roll a clip?
Oh, I like Japan. Japanese are crazy. Japanese are pigs. Pigs, you know? Monkeys. Yeah, they have small cocks, you know? Short legs. Yellow monkeys. Do you understand me, Sohira?
No.
I mean, is this album of particularly high musical quality, in my opinion? Sort of. But is it entertaining? Absolutely. Bear in mind though, if a non-Japanese person were to perform a sketch such as the one I just played, it would certainly be something quite different to entertaining. It is just so completely and utterly bonkers in such a unique way that it is so hard not to love it. I feel like I'm seriously overthinking Multiplies and analysing it too much. I just recommend you try it out for yourselves and just see what you think, because, it's quite something. God. Oh, it's helping my hair. Multiplies was an album I definitely appreciated for what it was worth, but if they'd continued down the route that that album set, and started taking their music less and less seriously, it might not have been exactly ideal. Luckily, the following year's BGM was not at all a stylistic follow-up to that record. The long-form version of its title is simply background music, but don't go into this expecting it to be the kind of thing you'd hear in a lift or at a fancy restaurant, because it's without a doubt the most experimental of their albums yet. It's basically like if the self-titled album took hallucinogenic drugs and completely forgot where it was and what it was doing. That's not to say it's not a composed or focused record. There's still no shortage of ear-catching hooks, but the trio take far too many artistic liberties on BGM for it to be considered any kind of pop album. Well, I mean, it gets poppy.
I'm Poppy.
But it's not the kind of thing you'd hear on the radio in 1981. You know what I mean. It's also certainly one of the most varied listens in their discography. We get everything from synth poppy tracks to electronic rock to ambient cuts to even a rap track, which is actually not bad at all. Though in terms of my own personal enjoyment, it's probably also one of their less consistent records, as some of the tracks that stay closer to the middle of the road can leave my mind pretty quickly, and some experiments don't work out quite as well as others, though also I might need more time for this album to sit with me. But there are some absolute bangers in here, and some of my favourites of their entire discography. The aforementioned rap phenomena is far better than it sounds. It's actually really quite tonally and timbrally striking, as well as containing one of the best instrumental hooks on the album. Other cuts like 1000 Knives just generally slap like... And Loom is an incredibly intriguing closer and probably my favourite track on the entire album. It's set against the subtle, insistent rhythm of droplets of water in a spacious area. It begins with a long series of ascending synths that build anticipation and even a kind of anxiety and paranoia. You'd probably expect a satisfying beat to come in after all of this, but actually they subvert your expectations by suddenly switching to a warm, blissful and serene soundscape of distant synth pads that envelop you like a warm hug. It's the kind of deeply calm, otherworldly feeling you get while perhaps diving in the ocean, or even drifting to the bottom of a swimming pool and just lying among the dappled lights and looking up at the distant, distorted figures above. Such a gorgeous way to end the LP. Now, as I said, this one isn't pure gold all the way through, and perhaps gets slightly overshadowed by the record I'm going to talk about next, but it's a damn solid set of tunes, and it shows that they still have heaps and heaps of creativity left in them. Speaking of which... Despite what its rather undermining title may suggest, Technodelic is not really a techno record in any way. It's actually probably their single most experimental album to date, being comprised primarily of samples and loops. In 1981, making this a world first, and not only is it the very first sample-based album in history, it's also probably one of the best. Yeah, it would not be an exaggeration to say that I was enamored by this album. You'd expect it to be some early, unrefined experiment in music production, but actually, it is mind-blowing how tasteful, eclectic, and seamlessly integrated their choice of samples are on this record. They still remain bold and adventurous enough to stay strikingly original, even to listeners in 2021. From the distinct harmonic flavour of gamelan percussion and its tuning system, to Indonesian kekak chanting, to their own recordings of things like prepared piano, the crackly retro sound of a two-way radio, it's a joyous 45-minute outburst of sheer creativity akin to their debut. They put everything and the kitchen sink into this album, and it paid off in spades. It even contains my favourite implementation of vocals and lyrics in their discography. I absolutely love how downright bizarre and surreal they are. I just cannot stop replaying this thing. I've listened to it front to back, time and time again, in the past few weeks, and it just keeps getting better and better every time. And I'm just left completely dumbfounded at how on earth this isn't more widely recognised for the utterly original, creative, groundbreaking, fascinating specimen of electronic music that it is. In my opinion, it's a purely brilliant, inspirational work of genius, and you must listen to it if you have even a remote interest in electronic music or sample-based music. I get the feeling there'll never be anything quite like it again. Most experimental era of their whole discography, the band decided to tone it down a little and created a record that was probably the closest they've ever come to straight pop music. But of course, an increase in accessibility certainly does not determine a decrease in quality. Naughty Boys seems to me like their take on the Japanese synth-pop scene of the time that was coined city pop, but while many newly emerging bands were rather unfamiliar with all of these new electronic sounds and created a lot of music that, as time went on, started to sound rather clunky and dry to new listeners. This was certainly not the case with the Yellow Magic Orchestra, as they'd already had a full 5 years in the business. We are currently in 2021, and in the past couple of years, the sounds and styles of 1980s music could not have been more popular. From Dua Lipa to The Weeknd to the melancholic nostalgia of vaporwave music and art, we cannot get enough of the glossy, sparkly sound of the 1980s and the neon-lit utopia it makes us envision and wish we could go to, whether we've ever been there or not. And numerous artists have been trying to repurpose the sounds and styles of this decade for the new generation with a new breed of technology. And Naughty Boys is so unbelievably well made that it could genuinely almost pass as a record that's been made with modern technology, just trying to imitate the style of city pop rather than something that was actually created in 1983. It's also gorgeously spacious, airy, blissful and serene, elegantly passing over you like a cool breeze, but remaining just as hard-hitting as you'd want it to be. Pristine and crystalline, yet never sterile or lacking in the emotional department. The songs on here are fiendishly catchy, yet still maintain just enough of an experimental edge that it's unmistakable as a YMO album. Some of the more upbeat tracks even delve into the kind of bittersweet euphoria that many vaporwave-tinged pop artists of the modern age, such as George Clanton and Small Black, try to recreate. Takahashi even proves himself to be somewhat of a vocal chameleon on this record, switching from his usual animated effervescence to a wistful, soulful, silky smooth tone that matches the sounds around him. Unlike many of its contemporaries, this album has aged like a fine wine, and is still an absolute joy to It still remains an absolute joy to listen to 40 years later. Just because it's not the most groundbreaking set of songs they've ever put out, do not turn a blind eye to their 6th record. It's genuinely pretty hard to fault it. Their 7th record, Service, is a pretty clear successor to Multiplies, in that it's part music and part comedy sketches. This time they're performed by the Super Eccentric Theatre, or SET, and they're even more prominent, taking up 7 of the 14 tracks, and often stretching on for as long or even longer than the pieces of music themselves. Oh yeah, and they're all Japanese with basically no lyrics to be found on the internet. Good luck, Joseph! So obviously I'm put at a pretty big disadvantage listening to this album in that half of its running time is taken up by dialogue that I can't make heads or tails of. They could be crap or they could actually be done really well. But the thing is, even if they were actual laugh riots, you generally come to an album to listen to music. If you do understand Japanese, you might actually have quite a lot of fun with this album on first listen, but even for those people, you'll probably come back to the record for a second listen and just end up skipping the comedy sketches and just listen to the tunes. Most likely they'd get pretty stale pretty fast, and thanks to just how much weight they have in the album's runtime, the amount of space they take up, it can end up feeling more like a comedy show interspersed with musical numbers, rather than an album interspersed with comedy sketches. 2 or 3 are fine. I was even fine with the 5 short pieces on multiplies, given that they zipped in and zipped out, and then went back into the next piece of music. But 7? Then again, it is obviously pretty stupid for me to try and critique sketches that aren't even in a language I understand, so how about I talk about the actual pieces of music on here? Well, they're certainly more focused and developed than the ones on multiplies, but I can't really say that's a compliment. There's definitely some solid tunes, like the first 2 tracks, Limbo and The Madmen, which are probably my favourites on the record, but most of it just kind of lacks the creative spirit and energy that most of their records have so much of. It no longer really feels like they're having fun and experimenting, and they're pretty much just resting on their laurels and, dare I say, almost running on autopilot, not really leaning in any particular musical direction, whether it's a new one or an already worn path for them. From a very intellectual and analytical standpoint, I'd probably say they were better pieces of music than the ones on multiplies, but my heart just leans far more towards multiplies than Service because of the sheer amount of bonkers and zany energy they put into it, which just isn't really present on this one. Along with my previous Orchestra discography review, this continues the pattern of bands having a pretty meh penultimate record. But along with that video, there is luckily one more record lined up for me to talk about, and that is... After a decade-long hiatus, the boys are back, but this time there's 2 little changes. One, they're now called not YMO, or YMO with a line through it, thanks to various legal complications, which is a bit confusing, but okay. And 2, they're long now. Unlike that other record with techno in its name, Technodon does certainly actually incorporate techno into its sound, even going so far as to directly sample Cybertron on multiple tracks. It's also definitely their most danceable and hypnotically repetitive album, which makes sense given that it's the only record of theirs made in the 90s. Speaking of which, the sounds of the 90s are noticeable on Technodon compared to their previous work, but they don't overpower the Yellow Magic Orchestra identity. They blend pretty seamlessly with their sound, and they're nowhere near sounding like a different band. Besides, the sounds of 90s music are pretty close to my heart, so I wouldn't mind anyway. Though as with Technodelic, it is diverse and eclectic as hell, with a healthy dose of sampling, here mostly of films and spoken word, which is pretty new for the band, but a welcome addition. There's even some seriously solid ambient music on here, often combined with some aforementioned spoken word passages, which help to evoke imagery and draw you into their world. I feel like after Service they needed and deserved a break, and it certainly helped them because you can just feel that creative spirit I was talking about before present again on here, which is an absolute joy. Sadly, as of 2021, this is the final album that Hosono, Takahashi, and Sakamoto ever put out as a trio, and while it's no poetically career-defining, fitting swan song, it's yet another borderline great album from these guys, and just goes to show that the gleefully inventive spirit of their music never truly faded away, and fills us with hope that maybe, just maybe, one day we could be fortunate enough to witness their magic in action once more. They are still touring as a live act, and Hosono and Takahashi released 2 albums under the name Sketch Show together, which I will be checking out at some point along with the endless sea of solo work and various projects of theirs. I feel I've barely scratched the surface of these 3 masterminds, but what my ears have already been blessed with has been almost pure gold. The full Yellow Magic Orchestra may have only had 8 years of activity, but they were 8 glorious years that they did not waste a second of. Whatever the future holds, this has genuinely been one of the most enthralling and magnificent discographies I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing. And what a time I've had. Thank you for watching. Oh. And what a time I've had. And now I need some sleep. Thank you for watching. See you next time.